The cell is underground. There is no window. No torch. The only light that existed when they were thrown in here has long since gone out, and now there is nothing but the sound of two men breathing, the weight of wooden stocks locked around their ankles, and the slow, sticky awareness of blood drying on their backs. They had been beaten publicly, stripped, flogged, and dragged through the streets of Philippi like animals. The magistrates wanted to make an example, and now it is midnight. The city above them is asleep. The jailer has checked the locks twice. And somewhere in the empire, no one knows these two men are even alive. Here is what happens next. They sing. Not quietly. Not timidly. Not the soft, trembling hum of men who have given up and are trying to comfort themselves in the dark. The Greek word Luke uses is hymneo. They were hymning. Projecting. The kind of singing that carries through stone walls and up staircases and into the ears of every other prisoner in that building. At midnight. In chains. With open wounds on their backs. And before we go any further, before we look at Ruth on a threshing floor, and Jacob alone at a river, and a garden where a man sweated blood and prayed until the ground was wet, I need you to hold one image in your mind. One midnight that makes every other midnight in this story make sense. We will get to it. But not yet. Right now, stay with Paul and Silas. Their names alone tell you something. Paul, a Roman citizen, trained under Gamaliel, the finest rabbi of his generation, a man who had every credential the ancient world could offer. Silas, a prophet, a leader in the Jerusalem church, a man trusted enough to carry the letter from the Council of Jerusalem to the Gentile churches. These are not naive men. These are not men who sang because they did not understand what had happened to them. They understood exactly what had happened to them. They had been beaten without trial, which was illegal, even under Roman law, for a citizen like Paul. They had been publicly humiliated in a city that prided itself on Roman loyalty. Their mission in Philippi had lasted only days. The little church they had planted, a handful of people meeting in Lydia's house by the river, was now leaderless. Everything, by every human measure, had gone wrong. And they sang. Here is what most people miss about that moment. The other prisoners were listening. Luke tells us, so the prisoners were hearing them. The Greek is epikroaomai, listening carefully. The way you lean toward a sound you cannot quite believe. Men who were in that prison for real crimes. Men who had no reason to hope for anything. Men for whom midnight was just another word for despair. And into that despair, Paul and Silas poured music. The historian Eusebius, writing in the 3rd century, described the early Christian communities of Macedonia as people marked by one strange habit: they prayed and sang at night, in the hours when the rest of the Roman world slept. He found it remarkable. He wrote that travelers passing through Philippi in the decades after Paul's imprisonment reported hearing singing from the homes of Christians late at night. The practice had become part of who they were. It had started somewhere. It started here. In this cell. At this midnight. And then the earth moved. Not a tremor. Not a small shudder. Luke uses the word seismos megas, a great earthquake, the kind that shakes foundations. The prison doors flew open. Every chain in the building fell loose. And the jailer, a Roman soldier whose life was forfeit if a single prisoner escaped, woke up, saw the open doors, and drew his sword to kill himself before his commanding officer could do it for him. Paul's voice stopped him. Do not harm yourself. We are all here, every prisoner. Still there. In an open prison, with broken chains and open doors, at midnight, and not one of them had run. You have to ask yourself why. You have to sit with that for a moment. These were not Christians. These were not men with any theological reason to stay. But something had happened in that cell during those hours of singing that had changed the atmosphere of the entire building. Something had entered that underground room that was stronger than the instinct to run. The jailer fell on his knees in the dark. What must I do to be saved? He had heard the answer already. It had been coming through the walls for hours. This is the first thing midnight does in the Bible. It becomes a stage. Not for the powerful, not for the ones with resources and options and daylight on their side, but for the ones who have nothing left but their voice and their God. Midnight strips everything away. And what remains? When everything is stripped, that is what the watching world cannot explain. Paul and Silas did not escape that night. They stayed. They baptized the jailer and his household before dawn. And in the morning, when the magistrates sent word to release them, Paul did something characteristically. Paul, he refused to leave quietly. They beat us publicly, without a trial, men who are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out. Even his exit was a sermon. But midnight was not finished with the people of God. Not by a long way. Now go back further. Almost 1,000 years before Philippi. Before Rome existed. Before Greece was a word anyone used for an empire. Go to a small town in Judah called Bethlehem, which means, in Hebrew, house of bread in a season when the barley harvest has just come in, and the threshing floors are full, and a Moabite widow named Ruth is about to do something that requires more courage than most people give her credit for. You know the broad outline of Ruth's story. A famine. A death. A daughter-in-law who refused to leave her mother-in-law Naomi's side even when she had every reason to go home. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. You have heard those words at weddings. You have seen them on plaques. But what happens next in her story is rarely put on plaques. Because what happens next is strange, and a little dangerous, and deeply human. Naomi hatches a plan. There is a man named Boaz, a wealthy relative, a good man, a landowner who has already shown Ruth unexpected kindness in his fields. And Naomi tells Ruth to wash herself, put on her best clothes, go down to the threshing floor where Boaz will be sleeping after the harvest celebration, and lie down at his feet. That is the plan. Lie at his feet. In the dark. At night. Without announcing yourself. And Ruth says yes. Here is what most people miss about her yes. Ruth is not a naive girl. She is a widow who has buried a husband in a foreign country. She has been gleaning in fields, picking up the grain that the harvesters deliberately leave behind for the poor, because that is the level of poverty she and Naomi are living in. She understands risk. She understands what it means to be a foreign woman alone at night, in a place where she has no legal protection. And she goes anyway. She waits until Boaz has eaten and drunk and his heart is merry, that is the text language, careful and precise, and she lies down at his feet in the dark. And at midnight, Boaz startles awake. The Hebrew says he trembled. Waiterad, he was shaking. He reached out in the dark, and his hand found a woman lying there, and his first word to her is a question. Who are you? And Ruth answers with 5 words that contain an entire theology of grace. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over me, for you are a redeemer. The word she uses, kanaf, wings, is the same word used earlier in the book to describe God's own protection over her. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. She is asking Boaz to be to her what God has already been. She is asking a human being to embody divine faithfulness. At midnight. In the dark. On a threshing floor that smells of grain and harvest dust. And Boaz, this good, careful, honorable man, does not send her away. He does not shame her. He does not take advantage of her vulnerability. He says, with a gentleness that has echoed across 3,000 years, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first. He covers her. He lets her sleep. He wakes her before dawn so no one will see her and misunderstand. And he begins the legal process that will make her his wife and restore everything she has lost. What happened in that midnight? A woman with nothing asked for everything, and a man with everything gave it freely. That is the shape of grace. That is always the shape of grace. Stay with me. Because not every midnight in the Bible looks like Ruth's. Not every midnight is quiet and tender and full of whispered faithfulness. Some midnights are loud. Some midnights are morally complicated. Some midnights feature a man who has absolutely no business being called by God and gets called anyway. His name is Samson. You know Samson's reputation. Reckless. Compromised. A man whose gifts were matched only by his capacity to throw them away. By the time we reach Judges 16, he has already violated his Nazirite vow, married a Philistine woman, and managed to start a small war over a riddle at a wedding feast. He is in Gaza, deep in enemy territory, because he's gone to visit a prostitute. This is not the biography of a man you expect God to use. And yet, at midnight, Samson gets up. The city of Gaza has heard he is there. They have locked the city gates and posted guards, planning to kill him at dawn. But Samson does not wait for dawn. He rises at midnight, walks to the city gate, takes hold of the doors and the 2 posts, pulls them up bar, and all hoists them onto his shoulders, and carries them to the top of a hill near Hebron. The city gates of Gaza. On his shoulders. At midnight. Now here is the part nobody tells you. Gaza and Hebron are not neighbors. The hill near Hebron is roughly 40 miles from Gaza. 40 miles uphill through the night, carrying the gates of a fortified city. The text does not explain how. It simply says he did it. Samson is not in this story because he is a good man. He is in this story because he is a chosen man, which is a different thing entirely, and one that should make every one of us uncomfortable and relieved in equal measure. God's midnight is not reserved for the people who have their lives together. It is not a reward for consistency. Samson is proof of that. Flawed, compromised, reckless Samson, and still the Spirit of the Lord moves on him in the dark. What do you do with that? You hold it. You hold it next to your own midnight, the one you do not talk about, the one where you made choices you cannot take back, and you ask yourself whether the God who moved through Samson's midnight is the same God who knows yours. He is. He is exactly the same God. But there is a midnight coming in this story that makes Samson's look small. There is a midnight that makes Paul and Silas's cell look like a minor inconvenience. There is a midnight in Egypt. On the night everything changed for an entire nation, a midnight so significant that God told his people to mark it on their calendars and remember it forever. And if you thought the threshing floor was dramatic, wait until you hear what happened in Egypt. Egypt. 1446 BC by most scholarly estimates. The most powerful empire on earth, at the height of its power, governed by a pharaoh who has said no to Moses 10 times. 10 times, God has sent a sign. 10 times, Pharaoh has watched something impossible happen inside the borders of his kingdom and hardened his chest against it. The Nile ran red. Frogs covered every surface of every building in the country. Darkness fell for 3 days so thick that the Egyptians could not see their own hands in front of their faces. And still Pharaoh said no. But this night is different. This night, Moses tells the people of Israel something they have never been told before. He gives them a date. He gives them a time. He tells them to take a lamb, a perfect one, without defect, and to slaughter it at twilight, and to take its blood and paint it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their houses. And then he tells them to cook the lamb, eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and to eat it with their sandals on their feet and their staff in their hand. Eat it ready to run. Because at midnight the Hebrew word is chatzot, the precise center of the night, the mathematical midpoint between sunset and sunrise, something is coming through Egypt that has never come before and will never come again. The firstborn. Every firstborn son in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon and Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews, confirms what the text implies, that the scale of what happened that night was unlike anything the ancient world had witnessed or recorded. He writes that the Egyptians awoke to a sound, a collective sound, rising from every quarter of the city simultaneously that had no precedent in their experience. Every household, every family, the sound of a nation discovering its loss at the same moment. And in the houses with blood on the doorposts, nothing. Silence. Children breathing. Fathers with their hands still gripping their staffs, ready to run, realizing they did not have to. The blood held. Pay attention to this, because this is the moment the entire Old Testament is organized around. This is not just a historical event for the people of Israel. God tells them, in the very next chapter, that this night is to be commemorated forever. Lidorotechem, for your generations. Every year, every Passover table, every piece of unleavened bread for the next 3,000 years points back to this midnight. Not to the daytime. Not to the crossing of the Red Sea, as dramatic as that was. To the midnight. To the moment when the blood on the door was the only thing that mattered. Here is what God was teaching his people at Chatzot. Midnight is not the absence of God. Midnight is where the covenant becomes visible. In daylight, you can convince yourself that your safety comes from your walls, your weapons, your wealth, your Pharaoh. In daylight, there are 100 things to trust beside the one who made you. But at midnight, stripped of every option, with a dead lamb's blood on your doorframe and your sandals on your feet, you find out what you actually believe. The Israelites believed. They ate the meal. They stayed inside. They trusted the blood. And in the morning, they walked out of Egypt. 430 years of slavery ended at midnight. Now watch what happens next. Because before any of this, before Egypt, before the burning bush, before the plagues, there is a man at a river. And this man's midnight is not about a nation. It is about one person, alone with God in the dark, fighting for his life and his future and his name. His name for now is Jacob. You know Jacob's history if you have spent any time in Genesis. He came out of the womb grabbing his twin brother's heel. He tricked his blind father into giving him the blessing that belonged to Esau. He spent 20 years in exile working for a father-in-law who cheated him almost as badly as he had cheated others. Jacob is a man who has spent his entire life trying to secure by his own cleverness what he was too afraid to simply ask God for. And now, at the Jabbok River, everything is coming due at once. His brother Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob has sent his wives, his children, his servants, and all his possessions across the river ahead of him. He is alone on the bank. Alone with 20 years of guilt and a brother who has every reason to want him dead. And then the text says simply, almost casually, a man came and wrestled with him until daybreak. A man. Jacob does not know who it is at first. That is important. He does not fall on his face in worship. He fights. With everything he has, through the whole night, he fights. And here is the strangest detail in a story full of strange details: the man does not overpower Jacob. He touches Jacob's hip socket and dislocates it, which tells you everything about who is actually in control here, but he does not end the fight. He lets it continue. Why? Because this is not a fight God is trying to win. This is a fight God is trying to finish. There is a difference. Winning means the other person loses. Finishing means both people reach the place they were always supposed to reach. God was not wrestling Jacob into submission. God was wrestling Jacob into identity. At dawn, after a whole night of this, hip out of socket, exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, Jacob refuses to let go. And the man says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." And Jacob, broken, limping, desperate, says the truest thing he has ever said in his life. "I will not let you go unless you bless me. Not unless you spare me. Not unless you let me win. Unless you bless me." And the man asks him a question that should have been simple. What is your name? It is not a simple question. It is the question. Because in the ancient world, your name was your identity. It was who you were, what you had done, what you were capable of. And Jacob's name meant supplanter. Deceiver. The one who grabs and schemes and takes what is not his. To say his name was to confess his history. "Jacob," he said. In the dark. At the river. With his hip broken and his hands still gripping the one who could destroy him. And the man said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Peniel. That is what Jacob called the place afterward. Face of God. "I have seen God face to face," he said, "and yet my life has been delivered." He walked away from that river limping. He limped for the rest of his life. Every step he took from that morning forward was a step that said, "I met God in the dark, and it cost me something, and I would not trade it for anything." His limp was his testimony. And if you are limping right now, if there is something in your life that marks you, something that happened in a midnight season that you carry with you every day, hold that thought. Because we are almost to the midnight that explains all the others. We are almost to the garden. But first, see the pattern. Every midnight we have looked at Paul and Silas in their cell, Ruth on the threshing floor, Samson at the gates of Gaza, Israel behind blood-painted doors, Jacob alone at the river. Every single one of them has the same shape. A person, or a people, stripped of every option. Darkness. No rescue visible. And then not always loudly, not always comfortably, not always without cost, God. Always, God. Chatzot. The center of the night. The place where the covenant becomes visible. Now let me take you to the darkest midnight in the Bible. The garden is called Gethsemane. The name, in Aramaic, means oil press. It is a working garden on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives, just outside the eastern wall of Jerusalem, full of ancient olive trees whose roots go so deep into the limestone that some of them are still standing today. In the daylight it is a peaceful place. Pilgrims visit it. They take photographs. They sit in the shade of trees that were saplings when Jesus walked among them. But you need to see it at night. At night, in the hours before Passover, the garden is dark in a way that a city person cannot quite imagine. The moon may have been full. The Passover always fell on a full moon, but inside the garden, under the canopy of old olive trees, the light barely reaches the ground. And it is here, in this particular darkness, on this particular night, that the Son of God kneels down and begins to pray. He has just come from the upper room. He has just broken bread with 12 men, one of whom has already left to betray him. He has washed their feet. He has told them things they will not understand until later, about a comforter who is coming, about rooms being prepared, about a peace that the world cannot give. And now he walks with them to this garden, and he asks 8 of them to sit at the entrance. And he takes Peter and James and John, the 3 who were with him on the mountain when his face shone like the sun, and he goes deeper in. And then he says something that should stop you completely. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Not troubled. Not heavy. Overwhelmed to the point of death. The Greek is perilipos, a word that means grief so complete it surrounds you on every side. Grief with no gap in it, no place where you can breathe, that is not grief. This is not a man performing anguish for an audience. There is no audience. The 3 disciples he has brought with him will be asleep within the hour. This is real. He goes a little further, just a stone's throw, Luke says, which is a detail so specific it had to come from someone who was there, and he falls on his face. And he prays the prayer that has lived in the chest of every suffering person who has ever read it. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Take it away. If there is another way, if the plan can work some other way, please. Take it away. And here is what the physician Luke records. The detail that no one would invent because it is almost too much to believe. Under the stress of what Jesus is experiencing in that garden, his sweat becomes like drops of blood falling to the ground. The medical term is hematidrosis, a rare but documented condition in which extreme psychological anguish causes the capillaries in the sweat glands to rupture, mixing blood with sweat. Physicians have recorded it in prisoners awaiting execution. In soldiers the night before battle. In people carrying a weight so enormous that the body itself begins to break under it. The Son of God sweat blood in a garden at midnight. And he went back to his disciples, and they were asleep. Not once. 3 times he prayed. 3 times he returned. 3 times he found them sleeping. And the 3rd time he did not wake them. He stood there in the dark, looked at the men he had chosen and loved and poured 3 years of his life into, and he let them sleep. Because he had already made his decision. Not my will but yours. 5 words. The entire hinge of human history spoken into the dark by a man alone in a garden. 5 words that closed the distance between what he wanted and what love required. Now, do you remember the image from the beginning of this story? A garden. A man. Sweat like blood. The darkest midnight in the Bible. This is it. This is the midnight that every other midnight in this story was pointing toward. Paul and Silas sang at midnight because someone had already sung in a garden and chosen not to escape. Ruth lay down in vulnerability at midnight because there was coming a day when the true Redeemer would make himself vulnerable in a garden, for her. Jacob wrestled through the night for a blessing because there was one who would enter the darkest night of all and emerge wounded, marked carrying a blessing large enough for the whole world. The blood on the doorposts of Egypt held back death at midnight because there was a night coming when blood would be shed again, not painted on a door, but poured out freely, and death would be held back forever. Every midnight in the Bible is a shadow of this one. And here is what breaks open when you see that. Jesus did not have to stay in the garden. He says so himself. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? He could have walked out. He could have called down fire. He could have simply refused, and no human power on earth could have stopped him. He stayed because you were in his mind when he made the decision. Your midnight was in his mind. The one you are living right now, or the one you barely survived, or the one that is coming that you do not know about yet. It was in his mind when he pressed his face into the dirt of that garden and said, "Not my will, but yours." He did not put the cup down. He drank it. All of it. For the specific, particular, unrepeatable person that you are. And this is the thing about Gethsemane that the daylight version of faith sometimes forgets. He was not serene. He was not composed. He was not the stained glass Jesus with the peaceful expression and the gentle light around his head. He was a man with blood on his face and dirt on his knees, and no one awake to sit with him, choosing love in the dark, because love in the dark is the only love that costs anything real. He chose it. For you. And 3 days later, but that is another story, and you already know how it ends. So here are the 3 things I want you to carry out of this. The first is this. Midnight is not evidence that God has left. Every person in this story, Paul, Silas, Ruth, Samson, Moses, Jacob, and finally Jesus himself, every single one of them met God in the dark. Not after the dark. Not when the dark lifted and the morning came and things got easier. In the dark. At the center of the night. At Chatzot. If you are in a midnight season right now, the darkness is not proof of absence. It may be the very condition under which the covenant becomes most visible. The second is harder. Midnight requires something from you. Ruth had to walk to the threshing floor. Jacob had to keep his grip through a whole night of pain. Paul and Silas had to open their mouths and sing when singing was the last thing their bodies wanted to do. The God who meets you at midnight does not meet passivity. He meets the outstretched hand, the refused surrender, the voice that keeps singing after the torch goes out. Your midnight is not calling you to give up. It is calling you to grip harder. And the third, the one I want to leave you with, is the one that Gethsemane makes possible. You are not alone in your midnight. Not in the philosophical sense, Not in the theological sense, in the most specific, literal, personal sense available. The Son of God pressed his face into garden dirt at midnight and chose not to escape. Which means there is no midnight dark enough, no cell deep enough, no riverbank lonely enough, that he has not already been there before you. He did not send a message from a safe distance. He came. He sweat blood on the same ground you are standing on. He knows what your 3 in the morning feels like from the inside. And he stayed anyway. If this story has meant something to you today, if one of these midnight scenes landed somewhere real in your life, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me which midnight hit closest to home. Was it Paul singing in chains? Ruth on the threshing floor? Jacob refusing to let go? Your comment takes 30 seconds, and it tells me that this work matters, and it helps other people in their own midnight seasons find this video when they need it most. And if you are new here, if someone sent you this video at 2 in the morning because they thought you needed it, and they were right, hit subscribe. Every week, we go deep into the stories that the Sunday morning version of faith sometimes leaves on the cutting room floor. You will not regret it. One more thing before I go. There is a detail in the Paul and Silas story that I did not mention at the beginning, because it needed to land here at the end. After the earthquake, after the jailer fell on his knees, after the baptism and the restored chains and the morning release, Paul and Silas went to Lydia's house. And the text says they met with the brothers and sisters there, and they encouraged them. They had just been beaten and imprisoned and shaken by an earthquake. And their first act of freedom was to go and encourage someone else. That is what midnight does to the people who survive it with their faith intact. It does not make them cautious. It does not make them quiet. It makes them the kind of people who walk into someone else's darkness and say, I know this place. I have been here. And I know what lives on the other side of it. That is who you are becoming. Right now. In whatever midnight you are in. The God who sang at midnight is still singing. And if you are very quiet, quieter than the fear, quieter than the doubt, quieter than the sound of the locks on the door, you might be able to hear it.